So before I begin my message, I just want to share, in past times here, when I have shared a message, I like to invite you at the end to turn to each other for a little bit of dialogue about, some of the things you've heard, and then reflect back as a community. One of the practices that our priests have is one of doing what we called shared homilies, because it really, I think, a lot more wisdom comes from these engagements when we can talk about them together. So I just want to let you know in advance that that's what we'll do today, and I have tried to keep my word count in check for that. So whether you have once recited the Nicene Creed by heart, or you carry a different relationship with Christianity, which could be shaped by devotion, disillusionment, or even domination, you've likely heard of the resurrection. Jesus died, and he rose from the dead. And maybe this story was framed as a miracle, as a mystery, as a metaphor, or even a mandate. So we're going to explore resurrection today, not just as a sacred story, but as a lens for rethinking power. Because if resurrection means anything, to Christians certainly, it means that we must live differently. It's not just about what happened to Jesus. It's about what happens to us. How do we cope with the crucifixions of our lives? How do we rise from patterns of domination that we've inherited? And it begs the question, what if real power is rooted not in control, but in care? So we'll begin by naming this theological terrain that many of us have inherited. As resurrection has shaped cultures and countries, churches, and human consciousness. It's been preached as proof of divinity, as God's ultimate power move, and as a cosmic reset button for human sin. But what if? What if resurrection isn't primarily about life after death? What if it's about a call to life before death? For any of us, all of us. So I'm not here to argue for a doctrine. I am here to ask what it might mean to live as if love rises again and again, despite every system that tries to bury it. Maybe resurrection isn't about escaping death, but about reimagining power itself. Maybe it invites us not into divine might, but in the willingness to accompany, to repair, to risk loving the world enough to change ourselves, to change it. So if resurrection is a mandate, I'm going to suggest that it's not a call to convert others, but to convert ourselves, to live differently, to move through the world in ways that make love more possible and more just. So for many Christians, the theology looks something like this. Humanity sinned. God, in divine justice, required a payment. Jesus stepped in as the substitute for our sin, took the punishment we deserved, died, and then rose again in proof that that debt had been paid. That idea is known as substitutionary atonement. In Catholic tradition, sin is still understood as the reason for Jesus' crucifixion, but the focus isn't on satisfying divine wrath. Instead, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are seen as a sacrificial act of love that seeks to restore relationship, drawing humanity back into relationship with God and one another, where that relationship has been broken. Now, every Christian denomination is going to have its own nuances, and those nuances matter because how we understand resurrection shapes how we understand God. Whether we see it as substitution, solidarity, or sacred mystery, our understanding shapes how we relate to power, to suffering, and to one another. And for so many of us, these theologies aren't neatly categorized in our minds and in our lives. They get tangled up in the coming and the going of our interactions and the daily living of our lives. For some people, many people, this story, this narrative has been life-changing. It has offered comfort, meaning, and purpose. And for others, it has brought harm. Because if God needs suffering to be satisfied, what does that teach us about power, about pain, about who deserves to be heard, healed, or forgiven? If the central image of divine love is a God who requires violence in order to forgive, then our spiritual imagination becomes shaped by fear instead of freedom. And it makes domination seem redemptive, necessary. It normalizes suffering as a pathway to holiness, even when that suffering is unjust, preventable, or caused by systems that we could change. So atonement-centered resurrection often leaves out the how of Jesus' life, his healing of the sick, his centering of the poor, his undoing of hierarchies, his refusal to dominate. So none of that was erased by his death. In fact, the greater risk is that those realities get minimized in this kind of resurrection theology. So let's turn to some other theologies of resurrection that offer a different vision. Liberation theologian Gustavo Gutierrez reminds us that resurrection is the triumph of life over the forces of death. And he's really not just talking about biological death, he's talking about social death, poverty, empire, and abandonment. Ivone Guevara, a Brazilian feminist and eco-theologian, sees resurrection not as supernatural escape, but as a deep relational renewal with the earth, with each other, and the sacred pulse of life. Elizabeth Johnson, who's a Catholic sister and theologian, says resurrection means that the crucified are not forgotten, that God doesn't abandon the victim, that divine love doesn't disappear when the empire gets violent. Grace Jisoo Kim speaks of resurrection as spirit-breathed transformation, a power that flows not through dominance again, but through deep relationship, returning us again and again to one another. This kind of shows how theology isn't static. It evolves. It lives in the streets as much as in our seminaries. And my own reflections today about resurrection really haven't been just shaped by Christian theologians, but also by justice movement leaders. Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde taught that love is a practice of freedom and that domination is not going to dismantle itself. Adrienne Marie Brown reminds us that we're called into participatory practices in a pattern of emergence, something that helps us build systems of connection and resilience. Miriam Kaba and Kelly Hayes teach that repair and abolition are lived commitments to care. Angela Davis helps imagine freedom not as escape, but as collective transformation. Their voices can help us see and imagine resurrection as the refusal to normalize harm, to insist that love must rise again and again through embodied practices. As a white, Catholic, cis woman, I am always in the process and the practice of unlearning these power over patterns that I have inherited, whether that's patriarchy, white supremacy, classism, Christian dominance. Theologies of resurrection that were shaped by empire cannot liberate us from these forces. Too often, they sanctify them. So, immersing in the thought life of movement work of Black, Asian American, Hispanic, Jewish, and queer leaders, especially women, has become part of my resurrection practice. It's a return to humility, to letting inherited false certainties die so that love might live. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg's work on repentance and repair reminds us that resurrection without repair is just denial with spiritual branding. Damon Garcia writes, "Radical reparation of an unjust world should be our goal if we believe in something as radical as Christian forgiveness." So I bring the question, what does it mean to take that seriously? To practice resurrection, not as a belief system, but as a refusal to let these inequitable systems define our relationships. To reimagine power not as a hierarchical control model, but as the courage to stay in community and be changed. Because power itself isn't good or bad. It's a necessary element of life. I mean, what could we do or achieve without elements of power? The problem is when it isolates instead of connects, when it polices instead of providing. And healing our relationships with power means asking, how do we use what we have to liberate and love alongside one another, as opposed to lording over one another? In everyday practice, this could look like engaging in mutual aid instead of charity, shared leadership instead of hierarchy, decision-making that centers the most impacted instead of the most resourced. Now, even Jesus' disciples expected a Messiah who would overthrow Rome. That expectation, they were stunned that that was not the outcome. But Jesus lived differently. The message of his resurrection is different because he healed, he fed, and he resisted empire without becoming empire, without dominating in return. He died on a Roman cross, not as just a defeated rebel, but as someone who never compromised his own deep faith and ethic of care. And when he rose, he didn't return with revenge. He didn't rise with an angelic army to overpower political tyrants, as much as anyone may have wished that he had. He returned with wounds. He returned to accompany his disciples in their grief. He fed them, and he breathed peace upon them. And then he guided them back gently to the work of community and love that they had been practicing together all along. So the message of resurrection, Jesus, listen, I died, but as long as you keep going, I rise with you again and again. Our power together will continue to grow. Holy power to heal, to raise, sustain, and nurture God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Justice here, justice now. Peace here, peace now. Where two or more you gather, I am with you. When you break bread, I am with you. Keep going. But that's not power as usual. That's a model of liberation from tyranny. It's the pattern that Jesus lived, even if many Christians haven't heard it preached this way as gospel. Resurrection, as Jesus and his earliest disciples lived it, isn't just an event to believe in. It's a rhythm we embody. It invites us to die to what dehumanizes us and rise into what restores. And we never rise alone. Resurrection always happens in relationship, in what Christians recognize as the risen Christ found in community. In the breaking of the bread, and the sharing of our cares and concerns together. And so if we're serious about resurrection, we have to be serious about how we show up with and for one another. So I'll bring us back to the heart of it before we engage in some conversation. Resurrection is not a return to what was. It is the practice of becoming what love requires next. And that begins in conversation and community. It begins with questions worth staying around kitchen tables and chalice circles for. And there is always greater wisdom in shared dialogue. And the practice of resurrection takes root in how we listen, lead, and love. So I'd like to invite you to take a moment to just sit with these questions and then turn to the people around you, 2 or 3, whatever you make of your little clusters, and talk about what you've heard today. And then we'll come back and allow some group sharing. So these questions are: where might power show up in your life as control instead of care? What would it mean to practice resurrection as a daily discipline, as presence to one another? And what needs to be let go? And what needs to rise for us as a community in really challenging global times? Now, those are a few thoughts you might ponder, but you heard many things today. So whatever is on your mind, please hold that and reflect on it. So I invite you to sit with that and converse. We'll come back in a few minutes.